In our Easter series entitled Simply Jesus, we are going to blend the story of Jesus going to the cross with the greatest book in the Bible, the book of Romans. And the book of Romans starts with true compassion. You see, the Christians in Rome had come to Jerusalem during Pentecost. In fact, Acts chapter 2:10 talks about the groups of people that were there to hear Peter preach that first message, and some of them strangers of Rome. It is after that time period they go home. But they go home with no Bible, they go home with no truth, and they're kind of aimlessly wandering in the wilderness, not knowing what to do. So Paul takes his time and he writes the book of Romans to these Roman believers who are living in a very pagan, sexualized world that had slavery and hurt people. It's an awful lot like our world today. The book of Romans is a legal case. It's a doctrinal statement. It's a theological treatise, if you would. Paul writes it, and so he shows people that they are sinners and that they are completely lost. But he also shows that Jesus is the only answer. So as we get started today, here's some things about the book of Romans. Romans contains the greatest truths from God. I'd like to add that they are some of the most difficult truths to hear. You see, in Romans, Paul, he goes all the way back and he says that sin began with Adam, and he builds on it. Romans 5:14. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses. And then in Romans, he reminds us that Abraham was justified not by works, but Abraham in the Old Testament was justified by faith, just like we are. And he says in Romans 4:2, for Abraham were justified by works, he hath wherefore to glory, but not before God. And it is in Romans we get the hope that everyone who has lost a child has. Because of God choosing little babies who do not have an opportunity to live, who are born young, babies are in heaven. It's such a great verse in Romans 9:11, ironically numbered that way. Though they, the unborn, those that are young, the babies that were born, not yet born, had been done neither good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, because of him who calls. Thank God the fact that God has extended his grace to the unborn, and those of us who have lost a child before it had the opportunity to breathe breath will have an opportunity in heaven to meet that child. But the book of Romans also contains some very unpopular truths. Some very unpopular truths in our culture today. You see, in Romans, Paul makes it very clear that God has a moral expectation for all of us. He has a role for physical intimacy, and well, the morals of the world Paul lays out very clearly are horrific. And he says in Romans 1 verse 26, for this cause God gave them up unto vile affections. For even their women did change the natural use which is against nature. And likewise also men, leaving the natural use for the women, burned in their own lust towards another. Men with men, working which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was met. But he also has an expectation for believers. And he says in Romans 12:1 about our bodies, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. You see, some of the truths in Romans are just so wonderful, the idea of seeing some of those little ones that we lost. Some of those truths are so profound that we were sinners from conceptions and that we are separated from God. And some of those are great examples that even Father Abraham, yes, Father Abraham was saved by faith and not works. But then Paul also gets so particular with some of those truths. And he starts to confront the culture of the Roman Empire. And it is no different than the culture that we live in today. And he says, God has some expectations for your morals. He has some standards for physical intimacy for you. And you have to take the difficult truths with the truths that make us rejoice. Because in the end, they're all true.